The other way to knit a blanket is to crochet it. The diamond blanket is great fun. I love knitting that. Well, hello, good morning. And we're in a slightly different position. I'm going to pretend that this is alive and I'm just going to film and do minimal editing, I hope. Because if you have been following me in the community posts and possibly in my email as well, you will know that I'm not well. I'm just going to wing it and go for it because we've done lives before. We can do this. So doing all the palaver isn't actually available to me at the moment. What we're going to talk about is blankets. All of the blankets I've knitted in the past and how they're knitted, why I knitted them, and basically there are lots of different ways to knit blankets. I'd love to share that with you today. Okay, so let's go. We have, first of all, one that I'm sure a lot of you will recognise. We have done 2 knit-alongs with this blanket. It is a favourite of yours and mine. It is the corner to corner. You cast on a few stitches. You get wider and wider and wider through one ball of yarn. You get wider and wider, and then you get to a point where you start decreasing so that you make a diamond, but it's basically a square blanket, and the stripes just go diagonally. So this is a blanket, and this is a method that so many people use to knit blankets. I love this. I've knitted 2 of these for babies, and it's become a favourite of mine. Not least because of the yarn that I use. It's a Wool and the Gang Shiny Happy Cotton. But this, it was something that you'd asked me for. Can you do a video showing us how to knit corner to corner? And I decided to actually make something more of it, so we did a knit along. Every single step, all of the possible mistakes you might make, all of that sort of thing. And we had great fun with it. And it's an easy blanket. You can make them of all sorts of sizes, from washcloths to very large blankets, and it will work no matter how many stitches you're willing to put on your needle. So that's probably the only downfall. You can only put so many stitches on a needle, and you might get to a point where you actually need 2 needles because it goes across so many stitches if you want to knit it that much larger. But yeah, the diamond blanket is great fun. I love knitting that. So corner to corner is the first one. So that is a lot of stitches on the needle. Now, also knitted with stitches on the needle is this one. Now this is probably, it might even be my first actual blanket. I decided, I got all of this yarn from eBay. It was back in the day when eBay was actually eBayers rather than a load of companies going on eBay and selling stuff at the actual price it is in the shop. So yarn was there. It was discounted, bargain. It was mostly discontinued yarn and outlet yarn that people had bought up in auctions, and they were selling it off at really cheap prices. That's what this is. This yarn, it was so cheap. I got 10 balls of this in one of the auctions for a £5, which seems absolutely ridiculous. So I bought quite a lot of this yarn in different colours, and I knew I wanted to put these 2 blues together. So the 2 blues, the lighter one is the border, as you can see, and one of the big things I decided for this blanket, I don't really follow patterns, I just make it up. I wanted it to be the same from the front and the back, so you couldn't tell whether it was upside down or not, which meant that stocking stitch wouldn't really work. You'd see the join in the yarn at the border. You'd also see that one side was smooth and one side was textured because of the formation of stocking stitch. So I created squares of stocking stitch. So it's like a checkerboard and it goes in and out. Basket weave is slightly different because you have bordered the stocking stitch, and it almost looks like a brick pattern, but because it's baskets weave. But this is more like a checkerboard. It's squares of the stitches going next to each other. This is nice and long. It's something that's actually a useful size. So I fold it corner to corner and it can go around my shoulders. It's something I might put on me if I'm sat in bed reading or something. If I am wandering around the house and it's a bit chilly, this is the kind of one I'd pick up and just stick over my shoulders. And it's very comfortable. It's not so thick that it's too warm, and it's not so thin that it's not usable in the winter. It's usable all year round. This is the kind of blanket that will go on the bed if it's just a chilly night. And I just want a little bit more weight and a little bit more covering on the duvet, and it doesn't. So it's just a single bed blanket that's really useful. So I like this. So much so that I knitted 2 of them. I didn't realise I had enough yarn. So it was 8, maybe 9 years later that I knitted a second one. Because I realised I had enough yarn to knit one, and I thought, okay, I really am going to go for it. It's the kind of yarn sat in the stash where you go, I want to save it for the really important knit. It's going to come along, I really think it is. But in the end, you just say, okay, I will knit with it, and then it will be really, really useful. And actually, yarn is a lot more useful when it's knitted into a thing than when it's sat in a box. Now, same yarn, different pattern. I first knitted this kind of lace pattern in 4-ply yarn, and it was a smaller shawl scarf kind of size, not a blanket size. But this is feather and fan. There are different types of feather and fan which have different names, but it generally means that you get a ripple edge. And yes, there are debates about what's called what all over the internet, so I'm not going to get into that. But just look this up and you'll find the lace effects that you use. And again, with this you follow knit rows and purl rows, and you make the lace obviously, but it's increasing and decreasing with different amounts across the row, which creates the ripple. So this has got holes in it. I've used it so much that it's got holes in it that weren't supposed to be there in the first place. Those holes have just appeared over time, and it's slightly larger than the other one, and it's certainly more elastic than the other one. That's just what happens when you have lacy holes all the way through a blanket. So I absolutely love this one too. Same real thickness and same uses as well. So I absolutely love this just as much as the other. I did knit a 3rd blanket, testing another pattern, and that stitch pattern really didn't work over a large item with that chunky yarn. So yeah, that was a disappointment, but never mind, you learn. Now we're going to move to not knitting with stitches on the needle and just knitting. So we've knitted with few stitches, increasing and then decreasing to make the corner to corner. We've knitted with stitches on the needle and then just going up and making fabric with that number of stitches. That's what you do with the 2 blankets that I just showed you there. Now this next one is about making shapes and sewing them together. Now there are other methods of making blankets. there are lots of other methods of making blankets when you're knitting, but this is about making squares, and it's not quite corner to corner, each of these squares. You cast on around the two edges, so you've got two edges of stitches on your needle, and then you decrease through the centre, and you end up with very few stitches on the needle right at the base here. So yeah, those are lovely squares. I used to sit there and knit one in an evening, and if I fancied a break from a current project, I'd sit there over a week and knit 3 or 4, and it would just be nice to do something different, to knit something different for a while, to pick up the different yarn, choose the colours that I was going to put together, and as you can see, it's all different shades. It wasn't really planned which shades I was going to put where. That happened when I put them together. And what was so fun about this was that I knitted this blanket and enough squares for a much larger blanket as well. This is 3 by 4 and the other one is 4 by 4. So that's 16, that's 28 squares I knitted all together. And like I say, it was in between other projects. It was an enjoyable thing over about 3 winters. And during the 3rd winter, I sewed them together and finished off the border. So that was good fun. But this is much thicker because it's all garter stitch. It's thicker because it's garter stitch with a slightly thinner yarn. But unlike this one, it's on the tighter needles for this yarn. This is on a looser, heavier needle for this yarn. So it's a looser, lighter fabric. This is a heavier, denser fabric. So it really doesn't show that you can make different choices when you're knitting with the same yarn. Obviously this is different yarn, but if I were to knit in a similar way to that blanket with this yarn, I would use a larger needle and I'd use a looser fabric style. Garter stitch is a thick fabric because the rows kind of stick together more. They're more condensed. So this is something that I really like about this. If I really need to keep warm, or I'm, just feeling tired, I fancy a nap on the sofa, then I will stick this over me and close my eyes for 20 minutes. So yeah, this one and the larger one as well, very useful blankets, especially for midwinter. Yeah, so that's brilliant. So those are squares, and they're knitted in an interesting way that gives you a lovely effect, and I really like that. Now I got the idea for this from a pattern on Ravelry. I just saw this image and I thought, I want that, I have to have it. So I did download the pattern and I looked at it and I got some inspiration from it. I did change it, didn't do the same number of squares and put them together in the same way, didn't use the same colours, but I got the inspiration from the colours. So yeah, it was a really nice knit. That was squares. Now another way to knit squares is obviously with the knit along. We're going to knit slightly smaller squares and sew them together with different patterns. So that one I just showed you was all the same stitch pattern, all the same sewing together style all the way through the knit, all the way through the blanket. The one that we're knitting for the knit along has got 4 different patterns on there, 4 different stitch patterns throughout the squares. So that's going to be good fun. Now, the other way to knit a blanket is to crochet it. Yes, I have crocheted in my life, and I crocheted this at least 25 years ago. I honestly don't remember when. I think it may even have been in my late teens, which is 30 years ago. But brilliant thing about this is that it can be very similar style in a way to the corner to corner, because you put the squares together. You can see how stretched it is by the fact that they're rectangles now. In that direction, instead of in that direction, because we have the right angle triangle. This is a shawl, it's not a blanket. But if we had two of these sewn together, this would look like it was corner to corner, because we have triangles around the edge. You could very easily make a blanket and just sew the squares together at an angle, so it all diagonally, and then you make triangles to go at the edges. It's a really nice way to do it, and it's just slightly different. So think about that too. How can you take inspiration from one blanket and just make it slightly different? So this is a very much loved. You can tell because I still have it. I was wearing it last night in bed, and I have worn it every year since I made it, and there were just the little bits of it that probably need attention, and little bits of the black border that I need to sew up. But yeah, I loved bringing the yarn together, picking out the colours to go together in the different granny squares, and obviously it's got a black background. I was inspired to make this because I loved Seven Brides for Seven Brothers when I was a child, and at one point the main character stands on the porch on the decking with a big crocheted blanket around her, and it's not exactly the same as this, but I loved the fact that it was all multicoloured and made up of different pieces sewn together. So it inspired me to make something like this, because it would be something like what she had. So I love the songs in that. Yeah, there you go. So that is lots of different ways to make blankets while you're knitting, and there's obviously one while you crochet, but you can knit in the same way too. You can knit the squares and you can knit the triangles. You've even seen how I've knitted the triangles corner to corner. There are so many ways of knitting shawls as well. Triangular shawls. That could be a whole video by itself. Yes, let's get together. Friday is the last day to join the knit along, so jump on board. We are starting on Monday, and the community's coming together on Sunday, so we can all say hello and introduce ourselves on Sunday. I really do hope you can join us. Love to have you in. I will see you there. Thank you for bearing with a slightly different set and a slightly different style of video. Just in case you're wondering, I have hand, foot and mouth disease, which is not the same as mouth and foot, hand and foot, whatever it is that foot and mouth that the cows get. Nothing to do with the cattle disease. It's usually children who get this, but adults can get it too. And it's actually the second time. This must be the second strain that I have. It's a funny one, I tell you. Oh my goodness. But yeah. Struggling to knit a bit because my fingers are spotty and raw. But this too will pass. And I can have fun by admiring all of this. I do hope I will see you next week. Fingers crossed I'll be making a video as usual. But until then, here's my pile of knitted blankets from over the years. Bye for now. Happy knitting.